Same thing that's going to get you from 1 million users to 10 million users is also what gets you from 100 users to 1,000 users. And so you need to build a product that is able to just grow naturally. Once you have a product in that state, then you can do some artificial things to sort of like kickstart it.
How deeply am I supposed to understand these AI models from like a math perspective about what they can or cannot do?
I think to really understand what an LLM can do and cannot do, you need to understand not just the math and the architecture, but often you need to understand the data that it was trained on.
I did not know that you were on the board of OpenAI until we all found out about OpenAI. But did you kind of know circa like 2020, 2021 that like this thing was going to be as good as it feels right now?
So
D'Angelo and I first actually met in 2005 when we worked at Facebook together in the early days. But obviously at SPC, we're all about the -1 to 0 journey. And I think very few people embody taking that leap over and over again like Adam does. He played a pivotal role in shaping Facebook's early architecture as its first CTO, and we'll get into that. He then left to kind of start Quora, where he was betting on a future where knowledge could be shared more efficiently. And that's obviously grown into a thriving product and business today. And he's also kind of played a low-key role at this like company called OpenAI over the last 6 years on its board. And, I think that each of Adam's moves in his careers, I think, are really grounded in very strong first principles. He's actually one of the most principled thinkers that I know. And I think in some ways, his journey has really been about solving hard problems before the world even knew that they were like really big problems. So Adam, welcome to SPC. Let's get a round of applause to kick this off.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's so I think Adam, most of the folks here probably think of your journey in technology as starting with Facebook, but I think that actually, well, maybe we can rewind all the way back. I was going to ask you about Synapse, which I think is the first project that most people might have heard of you working with Mark on. But maybe even before we get into Synapse, when did you start coding?
I got into programming in middle school. One of my friend's older brothers knew how to program in QBasic, and my friend showed me, and then we just started doing that in math class.
So, did you always know you were a coding genius? I mean, I'm curious. Like, did coding come easily to you? Like, was it the first, in the spectrum of things that you could have done when you were, 10? Was coding the first thing that you realized, like, oh, I'm actually very good at this, and that kind of led you to want to do it more?
Yeah, I think I could feel that I was somehow good at it. I remember I did there was like a math competition in middle school that I went to, and I did okay. And I think I was talking to my dad on the way home from it. He asked me like how I thought I did, and I remember telling him that if there was a programming contest, I thought I could have won. So I had some feeling that was something that I was better at than anything else.
Did you also enter like a bunch of the early kind of competitions, IOI, IMO, and all of those things?
Yeah, later on, I got into programming contests in high school.
Okay, all right. And so maybe talk to us a little bit about your journey as an engineer in high school. I mean, talk to us about Synapse and kind of what you and Mark built there.
So I started out programming. I was mostly making games for fun, mostly for myself, and there was a few people in middle school that we would show off games we had made, and then later in high school I discovered programming contests, and then that I think was, I actually think it was great that I learned how to program without the focus on programming contests, because it was all just kind of like intrinsic motivation and making things and going with what I enjoyed. But then later programming contests, I think, were very good for helping me sort of just sharpen my skills and just pushing me to get better and better. And then in high school, the last 2 years of high school, I went to a private school and met Mark, and we worked together for our senior project on a a program that it was basically a music player that had recommendations in it. So it would automatically play songs from your library based on what you had recently played. At the time, I think it was relatively unique, but it's what you experience today if you use Spotify and just leave a track playing and don't have anything next on your playlist. It's very similar to what that does.
This was built in Winamp, in case some of you might know that. So you guys built this, and I'm curious. At that point, there wasn't like even the math behind this, or maybe even essentially like the techniques behind doing similarity kind of recommendations, or kind of like figuring out using playlist history and so on, wasn't that well understood. So how did you go about in some ways figuring out how to do it? Did you reason through it from first principles, or did it just kind of like, did you see through the matrix and it made sense to you?
I think what we were doing was relatively simple. I remember we kept a log of every song that you had played, and then we generated statistics like after this song, what would you normally have played yourself if you were a human choosing it? And then we had those statistics, and we could kind of randomly walk through effectively the graph of the previous songs that had been played. But it was all just out of nowhere. Like there was nothing to guide us. It was just kind of like, what would we want ourselves? And I remember I really enjoyed using it as a product myself. Like there was nothing like it at the time.
Did you write in C++?
Some of it was in C++.
Some of it was in C++. Amazing. Okay, so I think Mark and you have talked about this before, but one of the stories that kind of always strikes me as somewhat insane about the two of them was that, hopefully this is not apocryphal, but Microsoft kind of offered them a bunch of money to kind of buy Synapse at some point. And at the age of 16 or 17, kind of turning down that kind of a check to go essentially from a place like Microsoft, I would have taken a bunch of money I would have taken $1 million at the age of 16. That would have been pretty nice. But then to kind of have the gumption to kind of be like, no, actually I can build more and better and more interesting things in the future. I think that takes a remarkable amount of courage at the age of 16.
Yeah, that's how the story goes.
Okay. Okay, so you worked on Synapse with Mark. Then obviously you went to Caltech, he went to Harvard. So what's the story of essentially what is your -1 story as it relates to Facebook? Like how did that initial kind of essentially time come about?
So I wasn't really involved in the early stages of Facebook itself. One of the things I did in college when I was a freshman, up until then, I had mostly worked on games for myself, and then we'd worked on Synapse and some other projects. And when I was in college, I had this idea to. I was very interested in AOL Instant Messenger. So this was the equivalent of messaging apps back then, and everyone I knew was on it, and it was a very important part of the sort of social scene among people my age. And I had this idea that it was difficult. You couldn't see who other people were friends with on AOL Instant Messenger. You could only see your own contact list. And I thought it'd be really cool if you could see other people's contacts and just kind of browse around the graph. And so I made this website where you could go and upload your what was called your buddy list, and then in exchange for you uploading it, you got to see your friends' buddy lists. And in about a week after launching this, I just told some of my friends about it and just kind of spread virally, and it got 200,000 people to sign up within a few weeks. And this was, on the scale of things today, that's not that many people, but that would just totally blew away anything I had done up until then. And it was a very important experience for me. It made me realize the potential of the internet. It was the first internet product that I had built. Everything else I had built before was software for one computer at a time. And it kind of it made me raise my standard for what I thought of as success and just what the potential was of things that I could build. So ever since then, I've kind of been focused on multi-user products or internet products, and I think there was a very important experience to go through that. I wasn't part of the early Facebook stuff that happened at Harvard. I joined in later on as it was starting to scale, and Mark and the founders needed help with the technical side. But I think there's a similar kind of experience that Mark went through launching the first version of that.
One of my earliest memories from Facebook is actually when I started walking up to Adam and asking him for some help with some debugging some C++. And I think Adam's reaction was that well, I don't know how to solve that, but why don't I write code in Erlang to kind of go and essentially figure out how to debug this thing for you. And I remember being that oh, I don't have any idea how to use Erlang, but if this dude is talking about it, I can actually just sit down and learn it. And it was a great example of having no limits, right? In the sense that I think when you go through university, there's almost these bounds that you put around what you are supposed to know versus not know. But then kind of meeting you, at least early in my own technical career, was a way of almost in some ways removing the bounds that I'd put on myself, which is that anybody, anything has whoever has written, I can just go figure it out. There's no kind of limit that I have to put on myself. So I guess my question here, Adam, is that is that something that, did you ever have to go through that equivalent thing, which is that it's all just code? If it's code, you can just go read it. You can just go figure it out. There is no code that you cannot figure out. That's the beauty of it in some way. Is that a conscious thing that you had to go through?
Yeah, I don't know exactly where that came from. I mean, I had to learn everything myself, and there wasn't the internet. Didn't have great documentation for things when I was growing up. So I had to learn sort of how to debug a lot of stuff, just on my own. But I do remember I was lucky to get to the USA Computing Olympiad in high school, and there was a camp that they brought everyone to for a week. And when I was there, one of the coaches, I asked a question about how some data structure worked, so something in STL in C++. And I remember his answer was, "Oh, well, let's just find out." And he just dug into the header files, and I just watched him figure it out on the spot. And that was kind of eye-opening to me. That it was wow, you can just that abstraction barrier is just fake. It's just something you can pierce through and just look at what happens underneath. And I think I had a number of experiences like that eventually just got me into a mindset of don't stop at any limit. Right? Don't unless you're hitting a hard limit, just push through it.
Two reactions there. I mean, this was actually a key part of how we used to think about Facebook engineering, which was that there was no bug that you were essentially allowed to say that this crosses some abstraction layer that, I'm a front-end person, so I can't go and essentially figure out that thing on the back end, right? These things are not, these stacks are not that deep. You should be able to, as a good generalist engineer, kind of go up and down the stack. You don't have to be a JS expert to kind of go and at least do a basic kind of JS understanding and fix it, and vice versa on the back end, right? And I think that as an engineer, or maybe even as more general advice in my life, I take that very deeply, which is that if you have confidence in kind of your ability to go up and down the stack of understanding, that just allows you to feel confident about traversing different parts of the understanding stack.
Yeah, totally. I would also, I think later on, one opinion I have right now is I generally don't like microservices, or this approach to building a complicated application where you're going to have lots of different teams working together. One idea people have is we should really divide it up and have hard boundaries between the different teams and maybe different services or interface boundaries. And I think you really don't want those boundaries there. You want it as much as possible. Obviously, there's sometimes you need to have separate services for performance reasons or something else. But in terms of management and making it easy to develop, as much as possible, you want it to just be one big code base and one big service, and so that anyone who runs into a problem can just go to the root and fix it at the root. I think that leads to much better application code over time. So it's I think it's kind of related to these experiences.
Let's jump forward a little bit, and we'll come back to some of the early days of Quora. But I'm actually curious. It's something that I'm not a matrix algebra guy myself. And then I did a bunch of machine learning in school. But one of the things that I often think about is how deeply am I supposed to understand what's happening in these models, right? Like these AI models from a math perspective, like how deep do I need to understand both the code and the math to develop sufficient intuition about what they can or cannot do, both in a short time frame, but also maybe. So I'm curious, how deeply have I'm assuming you've probably implemented at least Nano GPT or one of those, right? What's your take on how deeply software engineers need to understand what's going on in these models?
I've implemented some neural networks. I have not implemented the kind of modern GPT stuff from scratch. If I had more time, I would probably go and do that. I think that would be a good exercise. I guess the one thing I would say is that I think to really understand what an LLM can do and cannot do, you need to understand not just the math and the architecture, but often you need to understand the data that it was trained on. I think that's often that can be more instructive in terms of understanding it. And so if you go through the process of trying to fine tune a model and seeing what works and what doesn't work and what issues you run into, I think that's very useful as well. Understanding the architecture, I think, is also good. It's important to understand the performance characteristics and the scaling characteristics, but I think understanding the data is actually very important to understanding what the model is going to be able to do.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that obviously everything is AI everywhere and everything, but I think one of the limitations in terms of there not being enough kind of 10x insanely good AI experiences. I think most engineers, and I'll put myself in the same camp, still don't have enough of an intuitive feel for what these models can do beyond kind of acting as rappers or but really kind of stress testing what are they capable of. So I wish there was actually more of a meta kind of understanding of how to develop that intuition. So I think this is a good one. I actually that would not have propped up for me as something I should be doing.
Yeah, I'd also say just playing with the models, I think, is very important. There's, children when they're young, they spend a lot of time playing with things, and play is this just natural instinct that we evolved because it's useful for learning things. And I think as you get to be an adult, that instinct gets turned down, and then you also have a lot of demands on your time, and so sort of making space to have time to just go and explore, just test out, what are the limits of these models? Can I make it do this? Can I make it break the rules that it's trying to enforce? Can I make it generate code that works? Can I make it fix a bug that was really hard? Can I make it solve this difficult math problem? And just pushing yourself to get really good at prompt engineering. I think that helps you also understand what the model is capable of.
There was a good kind of segment with I believe her name is Amanda from Anthropic, who's kind of head of essentially the model tuning alignment, and she had this great segment. I think it was on Lex, where she kind of talks about the fact that her job is she's probably the person who has prompted these models the most out of anyone in the world. But she's I've probably done hundreds of thousands of prompts, and she's just because even for me. So even for her, it's just impossible to kind of get a feel for what these models do without actually just doing it. And she's every new iteration of the model had a certain different kind of feel to it, which is a kind of a good reminder that a lot of this is still kind of based on essentially some combination of empathy and intuition for what these models can do. Interesting. Let's go back to maybe So you were at Facebook for a few years. You kind of did some seminal work there in terms of building out an initial architecture. Then you moved on to Quora. Tell us a little bit about the -1 days of kind of how did you come up with that idea? Was it something that had been brewing in the back of your head for a while? Was it something that you kind of took some conscious time away from Facebook to figure out your next kind of challenge? What were the early days of Quora like?
Yeah. So I left Facebook in the summer of 2008. And of course, I just took some time off to think about ideas and try to figure out what I wanted to do. And I think there's probably a lesson here that I think is applicable to other people. It took me a while after leaving Facebook to get to the point where the ideas I had were not just like too much Facebook or like too, ideas that would have been better off done within Facebook. There was I think it was actually very important to take a break, and I imagine that a lot of you would run into the same issue. Toward the end of 2008, I landed on the idea of what I thought at the time was a new idea I was having of question and answer services, and I noticed that I really like reading, I like writing, I like thinking about things, and so I felt like a question and answer service is something that I should want to use myself. But then I looked at the products that were there, and you looked at the time, it was things like Yahoo Answers and Answers.com, and there was actually a whole long tail of other Q&A products. Yeah, and just none of them were very good. And I think the common wisdom at the time was that the reason those products were not very good was that they allowed everyone on the internet to write answers. And inevitably, if you let anyone in the world write answers, people in general don't know what they're talking about, and you're going to get bad answers. And we looked at that, and I think it was partly the perspective we had coming from Facebook. But what we saw in that was actually more of like a market failure. The incentives that were created by those products caused this bad outcome. And we thought that if you could do things like personalization to show people the questions that they were going to be able to answer the best, and then show people the answers that were the best or the most relevant to them. And if you could use machine learning to do things like quality control, then you could scale up quality much better than any of the existing services did. And so we just made a bet that there was a lot more potential than what the existing Q&A sites had achieved.
One of the themes that is recurring between what you just said and also between what you said about Synapse was kind of like this, hey, I enjoyed using the product myself, right? And is that a recurring theme in like how you choose what to work on? And this is for what it's worth. Like, this is something that I tell founders a bunch, which is that it's very hard to kind of continue working on something unless you actually it's easier for consumer things, right? It can be tougher for enterprise things, but for enterprise things, like, you should hopefully have some deep empathy for the problem that is being worked on. I think it is very hard to start a company that is solving for some abstract user that is a business problem that you don't know that much about or have never faced yourself, right? But coming back to you, I mean, is that a key, I guess, lighthouse, like kind of guiding light for you, that you must like using the product?
I think so. I mean, I don't know how this works. I think for consumer internet products,
yeah.
If you're building a SaaS company for like a very particular customer, it seems to me like that's not necessarily a good heuristic to use. But for me, it's part of my own motivation, and I think I would have trouble working very hard toward building something that I didn't want to use myself. But I don't want to push that as a general rule for everyone, because I think most software is getting created for customers that are just very different from the software development team.
What do you think, if you think back to the early days of Quora? I don't know, like, do one or two decisions kind of stand out to you as kind of being, in retrospect, pivotal to Quora's trajectory?
I would say it was much more that it was a lot of small things that added up, as opposed to like one critical decision. There was, there's a lot of choices in the product that all kind of fit together to orient around personalization, which today is not unique. Most products you go to, you got a personalized feed of something. But at the time, like if you went to let's say to Yahoo Answers or Answers.com or any of the others, it was just one page where you would see the latest questions that everyone had asked in time order over the whole site. And so there was, without personalization, there was actually this sort of like, you call it diseconomy of scale, but it was, the products would get worse and worse the more that people were using them, because you'd have less and less relevant content on the home page. And so for us, personalization was very important. But you can't just decide to do personalization. You have to build a whole system around it. There was like a follow graph, and there were topics, and then there's moderation to ensure quality, and you got to have a new user experience where people are getting to set up their graph, and so that's kind of something you can only do if you deeply build it into the product. And all the existing products, they just couldn't really adapt to that wave.
I mean, you have obviously you've invested in a lot of companies. You have a lot of founders and CEOs. You've kind of been a main character around Silicon Valley for 20 years now. But I think, in your experience, what have you done differently as a highly technical CEO? Because like at Quora, like, do you think that coming from a deep software engineering background has made you approach the CEO job differently?
Quora, early on, there were 4 of us who built the first version of the product before it launched, and so I functioned as most of my time as effectively an engineer, writing code until we started to hire more people. And but then then I kind of moved into being a CEO and spending more time on management and leadership and product. And I would say over the years I've oscillated a little bit in terms of how technically involved I've been. Lately, I've been spending a little bit more time on some technical things like architecture. So I had some discussions with one of my friends, and I realized that architecture is something that is very hard to change if you get it wrong. And as a CEO, if you have to allocate your time, you could think about, there's a lot of different ways you can review the work of the company. You can look at like final product screenshots before they're released. You can look at Figma mocks. You could use the product actively. You could review blog posts. There's a lot of like places where you can put your attention and sort of hold a standard. And architecture is one. If you have a technical background to the point where you have good opinions about architecture, architecture is a place where I think it's actually higher impact than reviewing things like Figma mocks or products that are about to launch, because it's almost impossible to change architecture once you get deeply oriented around something. Like these architecture, like migrations, can take years and just end up not being worth it. And whereas things like every pixel being perfect on a landing page, or other things about the product, you can just change them later, right? And you'll get feedback from your users. You run A/B tests. There's a lot of like forces that kind of make those things naturally evolve to the right state. Whereas architecture is just something that gets stuck. And so I've started spending a little bit more of my time on that recently. But I wish I had done that earlier. I think it would have been a better use of my time than some of the other things.
I mean, I guess there can be different molds of being a CEO, of being a leader. But if you think of being a CEO as really as like a systems designer designed to like maximize throughput, and what you're really doing with your architecture is like you're making sure that the system is designed to be able to move as fast as possible, right? With like the highest leverage. And I think that, that's not to say that final quality is not important. I think that's kind of like, making sure the design, the quality, the marketing, the positioning, the blog post, that is also critically important, but arguably a separate dimension from speed, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And like I have this kind of vague interest in lean manufacturing, and there's a lot of like interesting theory that's been built out about how to run a factory in an optimal way. And one of the part of the advice that they give to leaders in that domain is you want to, as the CEO of the company, you want to go and spend time in the actual factory, the actual place where the actual work is getting done. You want to go there and understand what's happening. You don't want to just look at metrics and reports and these like abstractions, because it's just such a multi-dimensional complex thing. And if you think about what is the equivalent of that in a software organization, it's the code, right? It's not just like the tasks in your task tracker or the dashboards or the metrics. It's like what is actually being done every day. It's mostly code that's being written. And so I think it's really like not optimal to just stay entirely out of the code.
Yeah, no, I two anecdotes I'll share in that vein. So I was in India about 2 months ago, and I went to visit Ola Electric. These are basically Bhavish's company that's building electric scooters, and it's really interesting. So he has this factory. It's a huge factory that did make like 2,000 electric scooters every day. It's about like 1 million square feet, but the factory is like pretty tall. But there's actually like a platform that is basically maybe about 100 feet high that you can walk through the entire factory but floating above. So I'm like, why do you have this? And he's like, oh, it's so that you can walk around and inspect what is going on, because it is almost impossible to get a sense of like how the factory is functioning in 3D space without being able to see it, right? He's like, I cannot tell from the metrics. And I thought that was just like really interesting. I also think your point about the code being like not losing the viscerality of the code is just like really important. That I think that too many engineering leaders just essentially treat it as an abstraction without actually getting in there and spending at least like maybe 7-10% of their time going in deep and like looking at commits, looking at code reviews, and so on. Tell us a little bit about it's crazy, Adam. I did not know that you were on the board of OpenAI until like we all found out about OpenAI. So maybe tell us a little bit about how did that. Maybe it's not even about you being on the board, but what were you seeing in 2017, 18, before I think everybody essentially like it became what it is today? What were you seeing in the early days of essentially LLMs and these large language models that made you sit up, take attention, and actually devote your time to it?
I've always believed in AGI, and just to make that concrete, I guess what I'd say is like I believe that software is going to eventually be able to do everything that humans can do, and I believe that for a long time. I just spent a lot of time thinking about things. I was heavily involved in some of our machine learning efforts at Quora, and I spent a lot of time thinking about the future. And so I didn't know when it was going to happen. I didn't know if it would be in our lifetimes, but I thought that eventually humans are going to be able to create software that is able to do everything a human mind can do. And obviously you can do a lot more once you can do that. And so this was just a belief I had and an interest I had. And so I was just kind of interested. I was friendly with Greg Brockman and Sam Altman as they were starting the organization, and I gave them some advice. It was kind of informal early on, and then in 2018 they asked me to join the board.
Did you have any sense of essentially how big a revolution OpenAI was going to unleash? Like, I guess what I'm really trying to figure out is like, I'm trying to also take your priors into account as kind of being like a strong AGI like believer. But did you kind of know circa like 2020, 2021 that like this thing was going to be as good as it feels right now?
I would not have expected it to move this quickly. At the time it was a small nonprofit that I joined as a board member, and it was they were having trouble getting enough funding, and this was before the Microsoft.
They do not have that problem now.
Yep. And it was, I guess I'd say I joined because I was interested in it, not because I thought that AGI is going to happen on any particular time scale.
How are you preparing? I mean, I'm actually genuinely curious about this. How are you preparing your children for an AGI kind of like world?
I don't know.
Our kids are about the same age, probably, right?
Yeah. I think that it's so hard to predict. That there's so many different things that are going to change, and I'm doing all the same things that you would be doing if this wasn't happening, because it's just such a like discontinuity in the world. Obviously, like you think about things like values and self-awareness and things that might be like especially valuable if suddenly you have all these machines that can do work for you. But I wouldn't say that there's like an obvious answer, at least that I've found.
No, it's tricky because in some ways the intuitive answer is to kind of like make sure that they have a very concrete understanding of what it means to be human and what it means to have like, in some ways human values. But that's but it's also like not a super satisfying answer in the world where some of what it means to be human might actually be to find value in the work that we do and all of these things that will probably be pretty different a decade from now, right? So it's tricky. I guess maybe in that vein, sorry, you are obviously also in some ways, kind of an AI entrepreneur because you obviously launched Poe as well, which is a new product coming out of like Quora focused on AI chatbots across all of the entire AI landscape. Well, why don't I let you pitch Poe? Like, what is your vision for Poe? How did that come about? And where do you see that going?
Yeah, so we started a few years ago looking at large language models in the context of Quora and trying to understand when is the technology going to get to the point where it could either ask questions or write answers. And Quora has always focused a lot on using machine learning and AI for routing the right questions to the right person and using things like collaborative filtering to recommend answers, but we hadn't used it to generate content. And we were watching the large language model development mostly in the form of GPT-3 at the time, and we were trying to understand how will this affect Quora. And so we did an analysis where we took a random sample of Quora questions and we generated an answer with GPT-3 and we compared it to the best answer that a human had written. And it was pretty obvious quickly that the answers were not as good as the human answers at the time. And for almost all the answers, for almost all the questions that we tested. And the conclusion we got to out of that was that the sort of like comparative advantage that the AI answers had was not in quality relative to a human expert. So often when a Quora question gets a lot of traffic, it'll get an answer from someone who knows what they're talking about and has some kind of expertise. And so the AI couldn't really compete with those. But the place where the AI was better was in a question that had no answers or one answer that might have been from someone who didn't really know what they were talking about. And so the conclusion we got to was actually the whole Quora product was so deeply oriented around the idea that a human is going to write the answer, and the human answer writer time is very scarce, and so everything needs to be conserved, and a lot of trade-offs are made in favor of what is going to be necessary to motivate someone good to write an answer. So that's things like when you ask a question, you have to make your question public. And that's important because most of the people who write these answers would not just do it for free in private for anyone who asks them. And but with LLMs, the quality was worse, but you could instantly get an answer to any question you wanted. And what this led us to was a realization that chat, like private chat, was going to be a better form factor for interacting with AI. This was a few years ago now, and so we started working on Poe. And in the same way that Quora serves to aggregate access to answers written by many different humans, we wanted Poe to aggregate access to many different AI models created by a variety of different companies. At the time, it was not a very diverse market of LLMs, but we've seen over the last few years the diversity has increased and increased. So on Poe today, there's about 100 different models from a wide variety of companies that do all kinds of different things: text generation, image generation, video, audio, and we're continuing to expand very quickly. But the value proposition of Poe for a consumer is that it's a single interface where you can talk to all these different kinds of AI made by all different kinds of companies.
And this is maybe a feature request. Why doesn't Poe do automatic like routing of requests to like the best model?
Oh yeah, we're looking into that. That turns out to be hard.
It's hard. Yeah.
It's we do a little bit of routing where we will route your request to an image model if you ask for an image, and we'll route it to a web search augmented
I've seen that
model when you ask for something where we think that's appropriate. But we're gonna do more and more of this over time.
Makes sense. It would be remiss of me to not ask about DeepSeek. So what was your reaction to like R1 kind of coming out? And do you think that the collective freak out was justified?
I think that if you look at the trends for how much it costs to train a model like that, it was not as surprising to people who know all the data points as it was to the public. I think that, I think basically whether we like it or not, the reasoning models are here, and there are going to be open source reasoning models that are increasingly powerful. My expectation is that OpenAI and the other big labs are going to be able to stay in the lead and stay ahead. But we have to be ready for a world where there's kind of uncontrolled access to these very powerful reasoning models. And I think I'm optimistic that we can have a sort of stable outcome for the world in terms of power dynamics and geopolitics and other aspects of safety. But it is a different kind of world than I think what people were expecting a year ago.
Yeah, I mean, in one way, I think that maybe almost the too practical a way of thinking about it is that at some point this had to occur, right? That like this collective sense of this is code. People can figure this stuff out, right? Like there isn't kind of like exceptionalism to kind of like figuring out how to make these things work. And it was bound to converge at some point in a way that I think, like China or India in the future, like they have a lot of great engineers. They're going to figure out how to do this, right? The gap will narrow, but I do think that the big labs, given sufficient, resources, should be able to maintain a lead. Maybe before I open it up to the audience, I have a couple of rapid fire questions. What would you say is conventional wisdom that you've heard that's right? Are there any kind of like words of wisdom you'd like to repeat to us? You're like, yeah, you should just listen to that. It's often right.
You probably saw the like meme around founder mode recently.
I love that.
I think that is right.
Yeah, I think so too.
It's now conventional wisdom. So
I love it. That's a great answer.
It fits, but I guess just to elaborate a little more, founder mode is it's a very vaguely defined concept, but the idea that you as a founder, as a CEO, it's up to you to make your company succeed. And these ideas that, there will be pushback from your team of various forms. Might be people like they want autonomy, they want to like have a chance to try out a different idea that's like a little bit off the strategy that you're trying to run. There's all kinds of different things that different people want when you're running an organization. You got to get everyone going in the same direction. That is how you have strength as an organization. And I think the founder mode kind of like revolt. I mean, it's a weird thing because the CEOs, founders have so much authority already, but it was like they needed this like collective like revolt against their employees to like come out and say like, actually you're going to listen to the CEO. But I think there's just like a sort of natural human tendency to like to be like a little more egalitarian than what is optimal for running a company. So I think that what is now common wisdom, I think, is right.
Yeah, one of the craziest things that, if, at least in the last 20 years in Silicon Valley, if you're an engineering leader, one of the common things you'd hear that I would go and talk to people about is like, oh, yeah, I'm just trying to scale. I'm trying to hire a bunch of people. I'm trying to manage myself out of a job. And then my reaction would be, as a self-interested kind of like individual, I'm like, I want to have a job, man. Like, I don't want to manage myself out of a job. But there was kind of this weird, I think, sense for a long time, often I think born out of like more classical MBA kind of like ideology, which is that in some ways, like, you're not supposed to get into the details. You're not supposed to kind of have a point of view. You should empower like the most technical or the best craft person on your team. But I think that for me, a lot of founder mode is like, yeah, you have to know the details. You might not know all the details. I think your job is actually to know what are the 2 or 3 things that really matter, and then get into the details, whether it's architecture, whether it's final like, marketing or like positioning or storytelling. I just think that's critical.
Yeah, like there's another way to frame this is there's an idea that the organization is supposed to be like recursive, like a recursive data structure. Like you are, you should be relating to your reports the same way they relate to their reports, and then that's the same way that they should relate to their reports. And every kind of system you set up has to like work recursively. And if that's true, then you obviously can't have people micromanaging details 5 layers deep in the org, because then it would just be chaos if everyone at every level was acting that way. But I think the organization is just, you can't run it as like a perfectly recursive structure. There's just got to be like, hey, this is the root of the tree and it's different. And so we're just going to have certain things that operate special because of that. And it can feel like not elegant, or it can feel like unfair, or like, not good management or whatever. But it's just, the focus has to be on what works and what's going to make your company succeed, and not on like what is going to be like really clean and elegant and always keep everyone as happy as possible.
And even recursive functions kind of need kind of like a base case, right? Where they're basically special case for the root node, right? So that makes sense even from a programming perspective.
I was wondering, in the early days of Quora, what was the main challenge to kind of acquire the content contributors? So that what was the incentive that you built initially before the like snowball effect?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is actually a case where I think recursion is relevant. So the same thing that's going to get you from 1 million users to 10 million users is also what gets you from 100 users to 1,000 users. And so you need to build a product that is able to just grow naturally. And once you have a product in that state, then you can do some artificial things to sort of like kickstart it. So in our case, there were 4 of us who built the V1, and we basically went to our friends and we said, hey, we're building this new thing. Can you all just please come and anytime you have a question, please put it on Quora. Even though you're not going to get a good answer, don't worry about that. Just as a favor to us, can you just do this? And anytime you see a question that you can answer, can you just answer it, even though no one's going to read your answers because no one's using the product? And just, please, just as a favor, please just do this. We asked about 500 people between the four of us we sent us a request kind of like that. And I would say about 90% of them didn't do any of that. But the other 10%, which is about 50 people, they started using it. And we started getting this increasing amount of content every day. It was very small, but it was enough to sort of turn into an initial very small community. And then as there started to be more interesting content, it was more attractive to their friends, and we let them invite their friends. And so it kind of grew from there. But the key, I think you should think of products like this in terms of, one is like there needs to be a natural growth path for the product. And that's the same thing that, Quora's at about 400 million monthly unique visitors today. They're coming because there's a lot of content that's valuable to them. But then some of the people who come, they decide to sign up and write an answer to a question. And then we have a little more content the next day. And then with a little more content, we can attract a little bit more users. And so that same loop is actually also what took us from 100 users to 1,000 users, and from 1,000 to 10,000. And so it's not, I would really encourage people to don't think about the early stage as being very different. There is the kick, like you got to get it kicked off. But if you have a product that can naturally grow, you can sort of, you can like light the spark anywhere and it'll eventually make it. I think I see a lot of companies put like a huge amount of effort into the early marketing or the early community stuff. But that if the product is set up to grow and scale, then it's gonna work out. And if it's not, then it doesn't matter how much energy you put into the early kickoff phase.
So based on how you described as the crux of the product design behind Quora, it seems a very natural setup for a human expert data annotation platform for large language models. And given that you're also on the board of OpenAI, so curious to the degree that you can share, has OpenAI or any other mainstream companies used some kind of internal Quora data to train their models? How do you anticipate the speed of this absorption of human data into the synthetic data, like synthetic being both machine and human generated? And how do you, let's say like among data, compute, and algorithm, which one do you think is going to be the most important to the quality of those LLM answers, if maybe something else? Thank you.
Okay, so there's a lot of questions in there. Let me start with the last one. I think compute and data and algorithms are all very important, and they combine in specific ways, but they're all important, and you need all of them. We think of in this world where LLMs can answer an increasing fraction of questions, we think the value of Quora that's in this world is the amount of unique knowledge that's on Quora that's not anywhere else. And so that an LLM is only going to be able to have a correct answer to a question for, let's say, for any question that involves facts. If those facts were not in the training set for the LLM, then it's not going to know the answer. In the case of something like a math problem, the LLM may be able to figure it out through reasoning. But if there's a fact about how a company does a particular thing internally, if no one has ever written about that on the internet, then no amount of like reasoning from the LLM is going to get you there. So a lot of the value of Quora for the world, in this world with strong AI, AGI, right? As powerful as it gets, the value is going to be what is the unique knowledge that's on Quora. So that's what we're focused on. We have we don't comment publicly on the specific data licensing agreements that we have. one thing I'll say is that if you write answers on Quora, there's a setting you can control in your settings to opt out of any model training. But we are sort of being thoughtful about where we want to sort of preserve the value of this unique knowledge staying on Quora versus letting LLMs train on subsets of it or certain train on it under certain conditions.
Adam, that was awesome. Thank you for coming by, sharing like a bunch of different parts of your journey. I think that thank you. Yes, thank you to Adam.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
That was another episode of -1 from the team at South Park Commons. Make sure to subscribe to our show wherever you listen to podcasts and find us on social at South Park Commons. And thanks to our friends at Atomic Growth for their support in bringing this episode to life.